A pull system is quite a bit different than a push system. The major difference is that a pull system, the vendor controls the rate of material flowing through the system. In a couple slides, you're going to see how they're structured such that the vendor has control. That's why it's called a pull system, because the vendor pulls the materials towards them as it is consumed. So as a result, the pull system focuses on actual consumption rather than forecasting. And this is very important because 2 weeks ago we covered EOQ, economic order quantity. And as I mentioned before, economic order quantity encourages large lot sizes, because in essence what that says is we're going to determine the largest lot size that we need in order to minimize total costs. So that right there says, hey, we are focusing on lot size. Well, it ignores a lot of other factors. I'm not going to go through that again, but there's like for instance, demand is static and doesn't change.
So for this system, it requires like things that are, you know, products that are consumed very rapidly.
Well, not so much the rate of consumption, but it requires a demand that has very little variation. Okay, when you look at like lean supply systems and theory of constraint systems, they focus on small lot sizes and small lead times. For that reason, if you get a small lead time from the time that we place the order to the time that the stuff gets to where it needs to go, you can make smaller shipments more frequently, and as such, you could better track the consumption. Okay, whereas like if you use EOQ and your EOQ is like 800, well, now you got to figure out, okay, how does that reflect my forecasting? If I consume 1,000 a month, well then if my optimum is 800, then I'm going to be sending one, and now I got to worry about sending a partial batch to cover the other 200. Then you got to have a pre-consumption level. Basically, there's like a level in which we say, okay, the lead time is such that we need to order when we hit to maybe 600, so that we make sure that we have 800 in the system. So all these decisions in a push system basically is based around large batches. So consequently, in a push system, the manufacturer controls the rate of supply. Okay, and this is important because the vendors automatically see what's consumed. They're very quick at it. This goes into VMI. This is why people like Walmart and other companies are moving to a VMI. It is a pull system with some hybrid differences, but for the most part, they have pull tendencies. And the pull tendency is the vendor says, hey, we need product. This is our rate of consumption. And manufacturer, you need to keep the flow of goods through the system. We talk about flow rather than batches. You need to make sure that the flow of products through the system is such that we always have this constant flow of materials coming to the vendor. Whereas manufacturing says, okay, in this period of time, I'm going to push 800 units to you. And you're going to basically tell me how much product you need. Now, sometimes manufacturers go into a kind of a hybrid situation where they link up with vendors and they determine lot sizes based upon what is required. So they'll say, well, okay, well, if our optimum lot size is 800 and they have 1,000 that they need at one time, then they will help them set up their pre-expended levels so that they can say, okay, we're going to make sure you have this much in inventory at all times based upon lead time, order time, holding costs, all these other things. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. I'm going to
Yeah.
assume so. Great. So now, um, that's the first bullet. Each link of the supply chain holds maximum expected demand within an average replenishment time. So, and this is factored by unreliability and replenishment time. So basically what this means is we say, okay, what is the average time to replenish a product to the vendor? So if the average replenish time is, say, 10 days, we're going to have 10 days worth of demand. If the store that's in question uses sells 5 products a day, and the lead time is 10 days, we're going to have 50 units worth of supply in the supply chain. It's kind of like if you have marbles in a tube and you just keep shoving marbles through a tube and they keep popping out the end. We're going to control the flow such that we always have 50 units in this example at all times going through our system. And this is why it's so important to have reliable replenishment times and have reliable demand. Now, a lot of people say, well, Lean doesn't use forecasting. Well, they do in a sense. You still need to forecast, but you basically forecast based upon current consumption. I'm sorry, on previous consumption and not current consumption. So what you would do is, let's say your replenishment time is 10 days. So you go and say, okay, during that 10 days, what has the demand been during that 10-day period? So you would say, okay, if it's 5 on average, then we do 50. But you always, but it's always a running average where you always shift that 10-day period over time. So that rate is always replenished based upon vendor information, which is why VMIs are very good for this, because if you remember, the VMI information, all that demand information is pretty much real time to the manufacturers. So, and one day they have a big spike in demand, they'll say, oh boy, our average demand that we had was now 7. Okay, we'll bump it up to 70 for that short period, and then when we do our next sample, as we shift our 10-day window, it may go down to 4. Then you may say, okay, well now it went down to 4, so now we need 40. So the manufacturer is constantly like either pushing more marbles in that tube, or they're pushing fewer marbles down the tube. Does that make sense? Roberto, so if replenishment time is 5 days and consumption is 10 widgets per day, then 5 widgets are required per day in the supply chain. Okay, it's 50 widgets are required in the supply chain. It's not per day. You basically would have 50 widgets worth of products in the chain. You'd have 50 marbles in it. So we're going to push out 10 marbles a day using our marbles in a tube example. We're going to push 10 widgets out per day. So we need to make sure that, because it takes us 5 days in your example to replenish, we got to have 5 days worth of marbles in that tube. Okay? Okay, wonderful. Got it. Thank you. So now, each link receives what was shipped or sold, obviously. For the manufacturer to understand what needs to be pushed through this tube, it has to know what the demand levels are. And so the demand adjusted when buffer management detects changes in demand. The buffer management is that sampling period. As we shift that sampling period, we go, okay, let me back up a little bit. In more complex systems, you have safety buffers. You have buffer stocks and safety stocks. Safety stocks are what push systems use to guard against excessive demands. Okay, so for example, I'm just going to make an example. Let's say you have a store that has 50 units per day that it sells, but the standard deviation at 3 sigma, which is 3 sigma from the norm, which is like 99.8%. Let's say that's 10. So you may have a buffer of 10 units. So what you'll do is you'll have 50 units ready to be sold and a 10-unit buffer in case we get more demand than expected. Now, if your variation is greater, let's say you've got a really sloppy supply system. Maybe your standard deviation at 3 sigma from the norm is 20 or 25. Your buffer's getting bigger. Okay, so now obviously it is ideal to have a very low variability in your demand. Consequently, let's say the supplier just isn't very good at getting products out the door. If their ability to get 50 widgets out is compromised, and they may have to ship, the vendor may have to order more than that 50 to ensure that they get their number that they need over time. This is where the bullwhip effect comes in. And we're going to cover that. I'm not going to cover that too much here because I think in 2 more weeks or 3 more weeks, we're going to have a whole week on pretty much just bullwhip effects. And I'm going to go over a few things with it. But so that's one of the weaknesses of a push system. So that's where the safety stock is. A safety buffer in lean systems is used to supplement the flow. So let's say in your example, Roberto, sorry, your replenishment time is 5 days, consumption is 10 widgets per day. So we have 50 widgets in our tube, but let's say that we have a little bit of variation. Either our reporting time is a little bit longer than we'd like, or the manufacturer doesn't have a very disciplined lead time. The lead time just goes from 5 days to 6 days or 4 days or 7 days. So what we'll do is we will put into the supply system in certain points a buffer stock such that if that supply drops below the 50 widget threshold for that lead time, that extra stock will just suddenly drop in to maintain a flow of 50 widgets through that whole tube. Does that make sense? There's a little bit of a distinction between how we do a buffer stock in a lean or a pull system and a safety stock in a push system. I tend to use the words interchangeably. I don't know if that's a word. Sometimes I'll say safety stock and buffer stock, but just remember that safety stocks usually refer to a push, buffer stocks usually refer to a pull situation. Okay. Okay, so pull systems focus on actual market demand and not forecasting. I already covered that, and which reduces oscillations causing over and under inventory. If you have actual market demand, the instances of bullwhip effect are much less because you have more frequent demand forecasting. Okay, I just covered that. So, any questions on this? If I don't hear anything in the chat, I'll just continue to the next slide. All right. Now, I'm going to go over real quick the advantages of a pull over push system. And this is important to understand because I think I said it in the first week. I frequently hear these arguments, well, push is better, no, pull is better, just-in-time is better, lean's better. In reality, it just depends. But to show you an example of a pull over push system, I'm going to go over basically a comparison of different products. In this example, oh well, whoops, I probably should pull that double. Let me take this out real quick. Hold on a minute. Okay, I can't. That's oh well. Okay, so basically, we have 3 items. These animals basically refer to 3 items. We have a cheetah item, one that sells very quickly. We have a zebra item, one that sells moderately or has average sales, and an elephant item that sells very slowly. So in a push system, the cheetah items will have a high inventory due to high forecasting by the centralized decision-making system. They go say, well, we move a lot of products through here, so we're going to make sure we have a lot of cheetah products in the system. We want to maximize profitability. So in a push system where you have a lot of stuff going through, you may be willing to go with large lot sizes. So the zebras have a standard inventory schedule, and the elephant will have a smaller inventory due to low movement. So in this case, in a pool system, that might be fine too. If, let's say, you have low obsolescence costs and the storage costs of these things is fairly low, you may say, you know what, I may put 800 of these things in a supply system. And if I only use 10 a month, I've got 80 months worth of supplies. If the cost is minimal to store them, that's fine. And I see this here in the UAE a lot, because you'll go to like a small store and they'll sell pencils. And the pencils, they probably bought a lot of pencils 10 years ago and they're still selling them. And they say, well, I've got a place in the back room where I can just put a whole bunch of pencils in a box, and when I need them, I'll pull them out. Doesn't take up much space. Cost of storage is low. Obsolescence isn't a factor, and spoilage, everything else. So yeah, my elephant items, I'll store them. That's fine. So now the problem occurs when zebras become cheetahs, and also when elephants become cheetahs and vice versa. So when zebras become cheetahs, the forecast lags for a small amount of time before it finally detects a change in demand. This is important because in a push system, the manufacturer controls the rate of product going through the system. So when the vendor detects that zebra turning into a cheetah, it goes, hey, I need more product. But the delay in communicating the demand to the manufacturer means that you're going to have a lag in the replenishment for that sudden cheetah. Does that make sense? So zebras that turn into elephants have an opposite effect. The store ends up with a high inventory of elephants that they can't get rid of. They order, let's say if the demand suddenly cut in half, now they got twice as much stuff as they need. And if you have stuff that has obsolescence, like in my industry, in defense, we have obsolescence issues. And I know like Apple does or anything else. So that can be hazardous. So that causes things like rebates or salvage costs or whatever they have to do. So what also happens is that people looking for zebras, they become cheetahs, will actually go somewhere else if the product isn't available. You've probably, that happened to me like when I used to use Apple phones. Then one year that zebra became a cheetah and there were no iPhones. I said, well, you know what? I'm going to use a Samsung. And I fell in love with the Samsung, but then all of a sudden something happened with the Samsung. The Samsung was a zebra and it became a cheetah. Now I use a Huawei phone, which is a Chinese phone, and I love that. My Huawei phone is my best friend. So consumers, when they see that their zebra product has become a cheetah and their product isn't available, they'll go look somewhere else for another replacement value product. And in tech, Apple probably faces this quite a bit. Maybe not early on because iPhones were always fashionable and new, but with all this competition, and Apple was a little bit slow in the technology department when they were going after Samsung and Android. So now Apple's ability to keep people who are zebras happy with the phone when their phones become cheetahs is not as strong. Okay. So what also happens is when a zebra becomes a cheetah, this creates an artificial variation in the forecasting, in which all of a sudden the vendor goes, oh, I need a whole bunch more because I got a bunch of cheetahs. Well, if the zebra became a cheetah for a short-term reason, like, I don't know, an article came out saying that this was going to be obsolete or whatever, this sudden panic buying creates an over-inventory situation once that cheetah becomes a zebra again. Okay? So a result of all of these that occur is that the variation due to sensitivity of demand is increased because, yeah, Morris's law, exactly. You're absolutely right. And I would probably say that there's a bit of elasticity in that because especially when people realize that this is going to be obsolete in 18 months, they're already looking for their zebra. But if they didn't forecast the demand in an 18-month window, that you suddenly have a zebra that's a cheetah. And people will go, well, heck, I still need my tech. Exactly, yeah. So but you're right, yeah. The obsolescence rule will feed that, panic buying. I got to have it now because, my thing's 18 months old. I gotta replace it with a new widget. And you have an artificial cheetah when it's actually a zebra. But what happens is when you have an artificial cheetah or an artificial elephant or an artificial cheetah is that your forecasting in a push system becomes biased. You inject variation into your forecasting. Now, to be fair, if you have a push system in certain situations where you have a very short lead time and the ability to get the product is out to the vendors is pretty quick, you may be able to have a push system that can respond relatively well. But you still have the delay in the vendor information going to the manufacturer and that delay causing oscillations in your demand. If you can reduce the time for your demand information to go to your manufacturer, then you have less oscillation, obviously, because now you have more. Your forecasting will be closer to real time. Okay, what I see a lot of times, and I saw this at Boeing, was they would basically say, okay, we're going to reduce our lead time by saying, okay, manufacturers, we need your stuff in half the time. And the manufacturers go, well, we can't do that. And Boeing would say, well, we need it. We have a rush order. And the suppliers would just crank them out. Overtime is authorized, everything. And they flood the system with all this stuff. But then as Deming has the red bead experiment, which is really good about this. But what happens is now you start creating a lot more quality issues and product issues, and things start to break down. So you can't really force these lead times. The lean system talks about the voice of the system, in which you let the elements inside the system dictate the lead time. Artificial lead times just don't work, or they may work in the short term, but they don't work in the long term. Are there any questions on that? Okay. And that's an important concept. In order to get a better forecast, you got to make sure that the demand forecasting is as accurate as possible. And the best way to make the demand forecasting as accurate as possible is to shorten the time it takes for the demand forecasting to go from the vendor to the manufacturer, which obviously in a VMI is very quick. Then you have other issues. I'm not going to go into lean supply chains because that can be a class in itself. One I'd love to teach, but unfortunately we only have 10 weeks. But there are other strategies involved. So now I'm going to go over to traditional push systems. I mentioned this for the most part. This is where we talk about centralizing stock. In this example, you have your production warehouse. And in between, you've got two locations that you have stock. One stock is near the production warehouse, and one set of stock is near the shop. If you notice, the majority of the stock is situated near the vendor or near the retailer. And this is how a push system works. The manufacturer benefits from putting stock as close to the retailer as possible. They use that to mitigate fluctuations in demand. If you put as much stock as possible by the vendor and the vendor pulls from that stock, You just have to monitor that giant stock sitting there to determine when you replenish. And you have a little bit of stock, I guess you call it a safety stock, at the production warehouse to provide for sudden fluctuations. Okay. So in this example, each of your stocks would be predetermined stock levels. And then when those predetermined stock levels go below a certain point, you would set up in your production warehouse frequent pushes of stock to those larger stocks. But if for some reason the demand falls outside of the window of your model, you have a little bit of safety stock that you push, which is the small stock. You know what? I got the little drawing here. I'm going to start using that. So this is kind of like a safety stock here. This is pushed to each of these whenever there is a variation in demand that needs to be adjusted for. Okay. And consequently, like I said before, the vendors pull from these stocks, but they don't control the stocks. Now, I have seen sometimes where the vendors do control the stocks, but for the most part, the manufacturers, because they know best their ability to maintain the stocks, they usually determine the rate that these stocks are filled. And usually this is where a distributor comes in, because you would have a distributor sitting here in the middle that would be responsible for monitoring when the demand is needed and then telling the manufacturer, especially when a distributor has multiple customers. So does this make sense? Any questions? Okay. I'm going to try to look at the group chat. Oh, how would what? Okay, go ahead. If you want to go unmute, you can go ahead. Okay, how would risk pooling fit into this? Okay, basically, this is kind of a poor example of how risk pooling would fit. But basically, what you would do is, let's say you've got 7 or 8 different stores. If you're trying to determine, I'm just going to turn on my pen here. If you're going to determine the size of your stock, and you've got all these stocks here, okay, what you would do is you would aggregate as many of your stocks as possible. If you remember, we had an assignment where you had to move all of your manufacturing to one warehouse, I think, and you had to basically service a whole bunch of applications.
Yeah. Well, you got rid of all your sub warehouses, basically.
Right. So in this example, you would look at the locations in which your demands are similar. Remember the law of aggregation of demand. What you do is you combine multiple demands, the amount of stock required to service that demand in relation to the variation of demand decreases. So what you would do is just say, okay, well, I've got these 3 here, and the more that you can aggregate your demands, the more stable this is, and the less stock you have to have relative to all 3. Do you remember the example in the risk pooling assignment?
I could pull it up.
Yeah, I don't have the slides.
That was week 3.
Yeah, I think it was week 3. So risk pooling would work well into this, because what you would do is they would say, okay, where can I aggregate my demands such that, assuming that no demand has an effect on another demand, such that we can aggregate these and therefore create less safety stock to address variations within each of these individual ones. Does that make sense? If I need to, I'll go back. Actually, you know what? I created a video on risk pooling that I believe covers this. If you want to watch that again, and if you have any questions, let me know. But basically, that's the theory that's behind this. You know, this is kind of like a risk pooling scenario where basically you are aggregating these three demands. Whoops, sorry. I'm gonna change color. Let me see if I can. Or not. Oh, I'm gonna try blue. So you're basically aggregating these demands to be serviced with this safety stock.
Okay.
That makes sense?
All right. So the 3 separate stocks wouldn't have their own safety stock.
They could. But in this example, you can use this as a risk pooling scenario where you said, okay, we're going to create one safety stock to manage these three vendors, because they fit the assumptions of the law of aggregate demand. Okay.
Okay.
You could easily expand this to have like another stock here, another stock here, and have the line here, another line here. You know, sure, you could have that. I'm really making a mess of this, but for this example, so that I can show you how the stocks are arranged, I just used just one stock.
Okay.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay. Yeah, so if you want, watch the video, and it should be able to be applied to this. Whoops. All right, let's go back to Mao. So now,
I guess the bigger question I had is does risk pooling change between push and pull systems?
no, not really. The concept's the same.
Okay.
Well, the theory is the same regardless. It's kind of like the law of gravity applies to every situation equally. It's just it affects each situation differently. Does that make sense? Like if I drop a feather and I drop a bowling ball, they're both get affected the same way, but one falls slower, one falls faster. So like in a pool system, we still deal with demand in a pull system, probably more so than in a push system. But the way that you would do it would still be similar, I think. But instead of trying to figure out the amount of product to maintain a certain level of product, you would do risk pooling to determine the amount of product that is required to maintain a certain amount of flow to the system. So the math would be the same, just the way that the stocks would be used is a little bit different. I hope I didn't confuse the crap out of you.
No.
Okay, I'm glad, because sometimes I confuse myself.
And the difference between the two is really what the product is.
Well, it's how the product is viewed.
So, like, pull systems would be necessary, like, day-to-day items that people are going to buy no matter what.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
push systems are like luxury items, more or less.
It definitely has that strength, correct. Like Toyota uses pull systems. And people buy car, it's something that's bought every day. Like in the defense industry, where you have a customer says, okay, I want to buy products over 5 years. This is how many I want per year. And your forecasting is relatively static. There's not much demand. If they say, I want to buy 30 fighter jets for the next 5 years, and here's your money, unless Congress kicks in, obviously. But even then, I don't know if you guys know this, but when Congress cancels a project, they still got to pay the defense industry penalties. That's why sometimes the defense industry goes, I don't want to pay the penalties. But nonetheless, when you're in defense and you have set demand, and you don't have to worry about those kinds of things. So a pull system wouldn't be that beneficial in that system, because the strengths of a pull system are all about how demand is treated. But if you have,
my economics professor explained it using stores. He basically said a pull system is going to be a grocery store, a push system is going to be Best Buy.
Sure, of course, yeah, or Costco. Well, actually, Costco uses push, but like if you have a place that has a whole bunch of stuff that keeps its huge stocks, that's a push system. But you're right, and I think I posted a just-in-time announcement in class where I was talking about how just-in-time came into being. And it came to being because Taiichi Ohno and several other people like him went to the States and said, wow, these supermarkets can get milk in the stores immediately, and they never have milk left over. How do they do that? And the store owner said, oh, it's easy. We got, guy has the cows, and he milks his cows every day, and he just shows up. I tell him the day before how much milk I need, and it shows up. And they said, wow, we can make cars like this. Literally, that's how it happened. So all of a sudden, and there's a story in Taiichi Ohno's book, which is actually sitting on my desk here, where he said, yeah, Japanese executives would go to the States just to go look at supermarkets. It was called the supermarket method or something like that, or there's a name that they called it. I think I put it in the just-in-time announcement. But yeah, and they actually called it supermarket method because speaking English was in vogue back then. So, it's like us saying Japanese words like, Jidoko or Kanban. We think it's really cool because it makes us sound smart. Well, they put the same about English. Yeah, I know the supermarket system. I'm really smart. So yeah, that's where it came from. And you're right. Your professor was absolutely correct, and that's basically what it is.
So, sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. That's all good stuff. So, in a pull system, the first thing you'll notice, where is the largest inventory at? The vendor stock or the production warehouse stock?
The vendor stock.
The largest stock is actually going to be at the production warehouse. Because you have
that buffer stock you're talking about.
Oh, yeah. Which one's larger? Obviously, the buffer stock is, right? Now, this is basically symbolic. It isn't always the largest. But what this basically says is that the vendor is in control of what is pulled to it. So in reaction, it says, hey, production warehouse, we are going to tell you how much product we need on a daily basis or whatever. And you're responsible for making sure that we can pull from you. So each of these stocks here represent basically a certain set of stuff, either 1 day's worth of stuff, 2 days worth of stuff. And as we pull from this, we are going to, at the same time that we pull from here, it's also going to pull from the buffer stock. Now, it's actually I need to be careful saying this because it's not really a buffer stock. It's like a large stock. Like, let's say the production warehouse has a stock of stuff, but inside of the production warehouse stock, they'll put buffer stocks to guard against oscillations in demand, like I mentioned earlier. And then they can also put buffer stocks here too. Buffer stocks can go anywhere that they can relieve demand oscillations. And this is something about, you remember the, oh shoot, what was it called? Hold on, let me look at my notes. Replenishment, let me look at my notes, hold on a minute. I just had a brain fart, sorry. It happens sometimes, believe it or not. When we look at, it was the same week as we covered the risk pooling. Oh, geez. I just had a brain. I'm just looking at my notes, see if I wrote it down. I thought I did. Theory of... Oh, let me... I don't believe... it was a theory in which we modularize things as far up the supply chain as possible. Let me look at my notes here so I can find it. But principles of postponement, that is it. When we look at principles of postponement, what we try to do is we try to modularize things such that, let's say this is, let me delete a bunch of this stuff real quick. A quick example of how this will work with our buffer stocks is like, let's say we have 3 products, and they're all relatively different, okay? Whoops. So we have product A here, product B, product C. They're relatively different. So what we'll do is we'll try to modularize as far up as we can, and then at the point that the modularity stops, where basically they no longer share the same modular components, and now we talk about what differentiates A from B and what differentiates B from C, we can put buffer stocks before that modularity point to basically keep the stocks going for all 3 products up to a point that all 3 products share the same subparts. Does that make sense? Then
a good example would be truck axles. American Axle makes the truck axle for 3 or 4 different types of trucks. But after that,
exactly. And then what they would also do, that's a very good point, yeah. So let's say this is 3 types of truck axles. But then let's say that you have 3 different American trucks, but they all have like different, I don't know, maybe they have different different metal used in the axles. I honestly don't know enough about axles to know. But we would just put in another buffer stock here to account for differences in demand specific to this product here. We would put one here also, put one here also. And these would be provided from here. Okay. So that would be like 2 ways in which we can use buffer stocks in this pull system. One, by using principles of postponement to allow us to have more, this allows us more flexibility by building a buffer stock that could supply all 3 up to a point that the modularity stops. So let's say if one's hubcaps, but they're all the same here, once a part gets to here, we can just have a whole bunch of hubcaps sitting here. Then we can just apply to them and then push it on. Okay, and that's how we can make a buffer stock that's more responsive to individual demands. Whereas when you do risk pooling, all the stocks for the most part have to be the same. Okay, all the stores have to be either A, or they have to be B, or have to be C. The demand types must be the same. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, I'm going to assume that it is. Sorry if I'm drawing a lot. I got this new stylus that lets me draw, and you should see me at work when I'm explaining things to guys at work. I use reams of paper to probably talk about seemingly menial stuff.
I'm a Marine, so everything visual works for me.
Yeah, I work with a bunch of former sailors, and they're always telling me, don't eat your crayons, don't eat your crayons. Being a former Marine, it's like, yeah. I said, yeah, I know.
That was actually one of my going away gifts at my last command, a box of crayons.
Yeah, that's funny. I hear you. Okay, so now, any questions on push and pull systems? Okay. I'm not going to go into the whole lean supply chain system. If you look at my references that I provide, I don't know if I provided them in the back of this, but it's in the announcements for, I think, last week and this week. There's a couple of references that are really good about lean supply chains, if you're interested. But once again, as you both gave had examples, sometimes a pull system works just fine. In defense, a pull system doesn't give you much benefit. It would, like, if, say, the cost of storage is really high and you don't want your manufacturers to give you 1 year's worth of parts ahead of time, but you can just make a hybrid where you say, oh, okay, fine, we know our demand, we know when we're going to need it, just create a lot size based upon how long it takes for you to put an airplane together. Although usually, in my experience, they always like to, because the government says, okay, here's 1 year's worth of money. So they say, okay, we're going to buy 1 year's worth of stuff. And I work in an industry where the government actually pays inventory costs, and you could roll up all those costs and have the customer pay for it, which is, I think, is very awkward, but they get away with it. So in defense, a pull system is fine. A push system is fine, sorry. But in, like, Mark's industry, where you're trying to sell phones in a saturated market with many competitors, you might want to have a pull system. Okay? All right.